Yeah, the AIDS situation was very, very interesting and a very gratifying part of my career. I moved from I was working in cancer trials from 1979 through 1988, and in 1988 I went to the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases as the first chief of the biostatistics branch in the Division of AIDS. So it was a new division that had been formed to develop large-scale clinical trials for AIDS treatments. AIDS was people were newly aware of AIDS in the mid to late 1980s, and when I joined NIAID in 1988, the only approved treatment for AIDS was AZT. There were new trials of a couple of new antiviral drugs had been started, and there were trials of treatments and preventive mechanisms for the opportunistic infections that ultimately were what killed AIDS patients. And it was a time, but by the time that I came in '88, the community groups, the patient activist movements, were in full force. They were very angry that there had not been enough attention paid to AIDS, that not enough resources had gone into dealing with the epidemic, and they were starting to be heard, and they were feared. They were feared, and the investigators in the new AIDS clinical trials group that had been formed were very fearful that the demands of the activists were going to prevent them from doing the kind of clinical trials that were ultimately going to give the answers that they needed. They felt that these people were misguided. So, but it was very political. Nobody likes to see a headline in the newspaper saying that this group, whatever, says that these people are murderers, and that's the kind of thing that was happening. So. About a year after I joined, I went to an international AIDS conference, and the AIDS activists, ACT UP in particular, were there, and they were quite vocal, and they were handing out documents that they had put together that described how they thought the clinical trials programs of the NIH needed to be changed to be more humane and to get better answers. And so I took one of these documents, and I started reading it, and I was actually quite surprised that most of what was in there sounded quite reasonable to me. In fact, I was surprised. They said, somebody who is in a clinical trial should be able to take other medications that they need for their health. Well, who could argue with that? These are young people who had a life-threatening disease, and if there were other medications that they needed, why should they be told in a clinical trial that they couldn't take them? So there were a lot of things like that seemed perfectly sensible, and that I thought there was no reason in the world that we couldn't accommodate those kinds of things into clinical trials. In fact, even if these were unproven medications, if lots of people were going to be taking these medications together with the antiviral drugs that we were testing, wasn't it important to know what the effect was in that context? That was the real world answer that we were looking for. So there were things in there that I did not agree with. For example, they argue that there should never be any placebo-controlled trials. And I thought to myself, well, we're not going to do a placebo-controlled trial of a new antiviral when we have AZT, which clearly saves lives. Now, we didn't understand at that time how short-lived the effect of AZT was, but certainly in the short term, it did save lives. But there were many other kinds of trials in which if we did not have a placebo, we would never know whether the treatment was working or not. So I brought this back, and we had a sort of a small meeting of statisticians who were working on AIDS trials, people in my group at NIH, people at the FDA, people from the statistical group at Harvard who were the statisticians for the AIDS clinical trials group. And I made copies of this document, and we discussed it, and there was a lot of excitement. And in fact, we actually had 2 members of ACT UP come to that meeting because they had gotten word that we were going to be discussing this document. They said, well, we need to be there. We need to be at that table. So it was a terrific meeting, and there was lots of agreement. And the people who were representing ACT UP were very involved and engaged in the conversation, but they listened as much as they talked. And we agreed that we really needed to have another one of these meetings right away because we didn't get anywhere near through the documents. So we organized another meeting. And at the next meeting, there were more people from ACT up there, and there were more people from the NIH, people who weren't specifically involved in AIDS trials but had heard about this and thought it was interesting and wanted to come. Some of the investigators started to come. They were pretty brave because at that time the AIDS activists weren't permitted to attend any of the planning meetings of the AIDS clinical trials group, because the investigators again just felt that they were the enemy, that they were going to. All they wanted was all the drugs right away without any clinical trials. And it was clear to us, the statisticians, that's not what they wanted at all. What they wanted was that the best trials to be done. They wanted answers as fast as they could get them, but not at the expense of there not being the right answers. So we had meeting after meeting, and at each meeting there were more people. The first meeting there was maybe 20 people. Pretty soon there were 100 people or more coming to each of these meetings. And they were very exciting. We just exchanged a lot of information. And I think these meetings helped the activists certainly. First of all, they introduced them to a lot of other people, so they had many connections now that they could go to talk to about the design of clinical trials. And they rapidly developed a terrific expertise. When they had come in initially to the meeting, they had a lot of expertise already about the drugs that were, they were learning pharmacology, they were learning mechanisms of action, they were learning about all of these aspects, but now they were also learning about study design issues. And within about a year, the ACTG leadership relented, and they became actually a formal part of the mechanism with different community members sitting on various disease committees and having a formal role in planning the trials. And it was a terrible time, of course, but it was a very gratifying thing to be part of, to feel like, we can work together. This is not an us versus them, and we did work together.